Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cal Raustiala, director of the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our final event of the term and of the fall and of the year, which is with Spencer Ackerman, the author of, I'm going to hold it up for you, Reign of Terror. Some of you have probably seen Spencer, read Spencer's work. He has written for a number of different outlets, including the New Republic, Wired, The Guardian, The Daily Beast. He currently writes on Substack, Forever Wars, which I recommend. And he was the recipient, along with the team surrounding the Edward Snowden NSA leaks to The Guardian back in 2014, of the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism. So he's worked for many, many years, really since the beginning of the era he talks about in this book, around issues of national security, the connections between the war on terror, issues at home, other international events abroad, and so forth. And he weaves all of those together in this book. So we're going to hear a bit more from Spencer in a moment. I'm going to welcome him on the screen. I'm going to get off the screen, and we'll come back and have a conversation after he presents a bit to us. So Spencer, glad to have you.
Cal, everyone at UCLA and the Burkle Center, thank you so much for having me. Really honored to speak before such a distinguished audience. So thank you for that introduction. Let me talk about the book very briefly, because the fun part comes when we get into dialogue. But just to sort of set up what I outline and present in the book, it's helpful to talk about what the war on terror is. Very often we talk about the war on terror in terms of its more easily digestible component parts. That is to say, its operations, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, CIA torture, drone strikes, Guantanamo Bay, indefinite detention, all of these things, mass surveillance, all of these things are critical and critically important aspects of the war, but very often, by focusing on the war on terror in terms of its components, we tend to overlook the broader picture of what the war is. And first and foremost, this is an operation that's lasted an entire generation, spanning not only abroad, but here at home as well. And abroad, its consequences are the best way to describe the war on terror. Those consequences were best summed up recently by the Costs of War project at Brown University, which, by using very analytically conservative means, determined that the war on terror has killed an estimated 939,000 people. That is, by its own admission, assuredly an undercount. It has also produced tens of thousands of refugees. The human impact of the war on terror, I believe, is the truest assessment of what the war on terror is. We should also recognize that the war on terror has been here at home in the United States the whole time. It is the post 9/11 apparatus of bulk surveillance set up by the NSA, accessed by the FBI for warrantless surveillance on Americans. It's the counterterrorismification, shall we say, of immigration, the bureaucratic context for transforming immigration from a process to produce more Americans into a process that threatens Americans that are already here. It's FBI roundups of people that take place after 9/11, and then the mapping of entire communities without suspicion of a crime that happens in Muslim communities since 9/11 and ever since 9/11. It's the NYPD, the largest police department in the United States, bringing on CIA retired and even at times current personnel to transform it into something much more like a secret police, whereby informants and agents infiltrate Muslim communities around New York. The FBI did this around the country as well, including violating people's places of worship. Informants are placed inside mosques. And somehow, we understand what the somehow is, but this is never considered fundamental violations of the First Amendment, of the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. As well, recall what the politics of the war on terror have been, as well as the culture of the war on terror. From the start, the war on terror politically is a reactionary enterprise. It's one that reaches into the most nativistic, racist currents of American history and gives them new license under guise of patriotic emergency to have a path back to power. We see this very clearly in not only who the war on terror applies to, which is to say Muslims at home and abroad, but especially who the war on terror never applies to, which is to say the apparatus of white political violence in this country. The comparison to Oklahoma City just 6 years before 9/11 is very instructive. There, both in the aftermath of a white supremacist committing the worst act of terrorism on US soil to that point, all of the political, journalistic, and cultural response to Oklahoma City obscures the white supremacist motivation of Timothy McVeigh. It doesn't look beyond McVeigh and his direct co-conspirator at any sort of broader network, either ideological or operational, beyond McVeigh and his colleague Terry Nichols for this crime. And as well, it doesn't seek to criminalize those who might share in, vague ideological as opposed to operational affiliation with McVeigh. In fact, the principal legislation emerging from Oklahoma City explicitly exempts white supremacist and other forms of domestic terrorism, which is to say it focuses only on foreign emanating terrorism, which is also to say it is a euphemism for, at the time in context, looking just at terrorism that emanates from Muslims abroad. This is the precursor to what after 9/11 will be a body of law particularly supercharged by the Patriot Act, known as material support for terrorism. That only exists, functionally speaking, for Muslim terrorism with an overseas connection, none of it for white supremacist terrorism here at home. That, of course, fits into and helps get us back to the politics of the war on terror, which is one that assiduously throughout American history exempts and normalizes white political violence and considers non-white political violence to be a threat to the state. Finally, the 9/11 era is complete with delusions, lies, evasions, and euphemisms that conceal the enterprise, that are sort of central to it, from Saddam Hussein phantom ties to Al-Qaeda, to his current possession of weapons of mass destruction, to bringing democracy to Iraq, to the CIA treating torture as what it calls enhanced interrogations, or drone strikes as what it calls targeted killings, or broad, suspicionless bulk surveillance as what the NSA calls the terrorist surveillance program. These are big lies and are the ways in which atrocities get normalized. But here's the other aspect of the war on terror that really very often doesn't tend to get focused on, which is that there are political consequences to the way that it yields neither peace nor victory, which is to say, the elites that launch the war on terror, that valorize it as this grand national enterprise, this reassertion of American power onto the world stage that will produce the enduring stability that they believe 9/11 demonstrated America was no longer possessing. Instead, it demonstrated American weakness in the most agonizing possible ways, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but beyond, in the ways that the war on terror sprawls to all of these new undeclared battlefields, but still gets no closer to victory, even after President Obama opts, particularly after President Obama, opts not to declare victory after killing Osama bin Laden. What this leads to is this cognitive dissonance amongst the people who are the most fervent believers in the war on terror, those who believe the messages from their leaders about this civilizational danger that something Islamic poses to the United States. In that experience of cognitive dissonance, there is simple opportunity for people like Donald Trump to explain how it is that all of this violence, all of this expense, all of this bloodshed has led not to security, but into, in this case, in 2015, when he started making this argument, the emergence of ISIS. That was not an explanation that said that the war on terror was doomed to failure, doomed to replicate the mistakes that prompted it and make all of them worse, which is to say, the application of American global dominance and policing of the Muslim world. But instead that the incompetent elites that created and maintained and justified the war on terror were insufficiently brutal and insufficiently civilizationally focused. That was how Donald Trump simultaneously escalated the war on terror while posing rhetorically as its critic and also getting to something closer to where these political trends converge, which is in the summer of 2020, where Trump declares, in the face of widespread protest for Black liberation after the police murder of George Floyd, that those protesting are in fact terrorists themselves, that anti-fascists and Black Lives Matter supporters are terrorists, that, as he has Attorney General William Barr perform, that the joint terrorism task forces, which are state, local, federal law enforcement partnerships, look at those protesters in a counterterrorism context. It's how the Department of Homeland Security launched drone and other aerial surveillance over 15 cities where protesters were on the streets. It is how, during the protests in Portland, DHS and Justice Department officials were snatching people off the streets and putting them in unmarked vans to detention, using less lethal rounds on protesters, which is to say rubber-coated bullets, taking headshots at them, and kitted up essentially as if they were fighting an urban counterinsurgency. As all of this coalesces, the war on terror has not reached its final form yet, even though President Biden has withdrawn from Afghanistan. And I would, right as we go into questions, just leave everyone with an understanding that it is important to pay attention to how the war on terror provides all of these authoritarian possibilities, that it provides all of these justifications for authoritarian usage, that as we saw from the last year of the Trump presidency and then from January 6th, that all of these opportunities, once on the table, are very likely to be used. It is not frivolous. It is rather central that the QAnon conspiracy theory views itself fantasizing about locking up Trump's political enemies in Guantanamo Bay. The war on terror accustomed to see this as a possibility, as a potentiality, and that is why ultimately Trump uses the opportunities that the war on terror provides. All of these are live potential going forward as we enter what appears to be this sustained period of domestic emergency for our democracy. And I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Spencer. And let me first say, having read the book and having lived through this period, as I think many of probably the listeners and watchers to this event have, it's still very illuminating the way that you bring back things that either I had forgotten or really had not fully thought through. And you very expertly weave together all of these events, which are really disturbing in a lot of ways, as you made clear in your opening remarks, but sort of putting them together in a single package makes them even more powerful. So it's a very good book, and I recommend it. With that in mind, I want to sort of align myself with the general thrust of the book and then press on a few points where I just want to understand more what your argument really is, or how you see the big picture in particular. And maybe I'll start with where you just ended, which is the phenomenon of Trump, which I know interests a lot of people on the left and really across the spectrum a lot. And so you make the claim, even in your title, that the war on terror, the 9/11 era produced Trump. And you just, I think, pointed to some of the ways in which you sustain that or try to sustain that case. And is it fair to say that you think the reason that the 9/11 era produced Trump was the valorization of authoritarian acts and tendencies and a set of tools that were not available before? Is that sort of a fair characterization?
Not really. More accurately, it's that the war on terror, it's not the only thing that produces Trump, of course. What it is an atmosphere of emergency for all of the other tendencies that produce Trump, the nativism, the racism, all of these things that are just, beneath the surface, frankly, in typical American life, but find themselves with this opportunity once all of this civilizationally focused, normalized violence is politically acceptable and accepted and has its own dictates. And then also the structures of the war on terror provide all of the opportunities that authoritarians would ultimately want. It not only weakens the institutional architecture that's supposed to protect American democracy and each of our liberties, but it institutionalizes the exact opposite. Rather than strengthening due process, for instance, we have states of exception, we have Guantanamo Bay, we have the CIA black sites, we have even, the black sidization of immigration detention, which the war on terror stretches throughout the country. It is the thing that creates ICE, for instance. So there we have, both in terms of culture, in terms of politics, and in terms of institutional presentation, that is what produces Trump from the war on terror. I would just add one final thing.
Go ahead.
Think about birtherism, the conspiracy theory that holds that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, but was a secret Kenyan Muslim. Well, the anti-Black racism of that really screams so loud that it can tend to drown out what the rest of that, what the rest of the force of the conspiracy theory is doing, which is to portray Barack Obama as an enemy of the United States because he is foreign, because he is Muslim, because the war on terror had for nearly 10 years up to that point told the country that that was the sort of person who was a terrorist, and that your political adversary, who you might think is Barack Obama, and who you might think is his coalition, is not your political adversary at all. They are your enemy, and they are here and they have power. And what will you do in response to it? It is in that sense that we get Trumpist polemicizations, like one shortly before the 2016 election by someone who would go on to be the spokesman for his National Security Council, calling the 2016 election the Flight 93 election, which is to say that unless, frankly, an act of martyrdom took place under which a whole lot is justified, then the entire enterprise of America was going to be destroyed. This is the wages of the war on terror. And we can see from the way, just this week, Lauren Boebert, the Colorado GOP congresswoman, called her colleague, the Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, a suicide bomber. That this is all still a very live aspect of American political life.
I'm glad you raised Obama, because one of the things that's most interesting about the book, and I think most important, especially for what I'm going to guess is your kind of natural viewership and readership, and probably most of my students as well, is the role that Obama played. And I want to get back to that, but I just want to press you on this point. Did the 9/11 era also produce Obama? And if so, how do you explain that? And if not, what's the distinction between the two presidents? We'll leave Joe Biden for a moment.
Well, you said Joe Biden as well, or we'll come?
No, well, we can leave Biden out, or you can include him if you want. But I guess the real question is, does the same cause explain? We have very different presidents. Now, you point out helpfully in the book that Obama is less different than many people might believe, especially most Democrats, I think, don't appreciate the degree to which Obama stepped up the drone program, for example, continued Guantanamo despite pledges to do the opposite. So I think you very helpfully show there's actually much more continuity than people tend to think. But all of that said, the rhetoric, the style, and even the substance of Barack Obama and Donald Trump are quite different. But the same era is in question. So I'm just asking, how do you see the connection, especially with regard to the big thesis of your book?
Sure. So some of the antibodies, politically speaking, of the 9/11 era explain Barack Obama, which is to say the abject disaster of the Iraq War, which is pretty much the reason why Obama could be elected in the first place. The problem is that the 9/11 era explains Barack Obama in a different way, which is within the context of liberal acquiescence and even complicity in the war on terror. Remember the famous speech that Obama gives in 2002, which is, by contemporary political terms, an incredibly brave speech. As a state senator, he's rejecting the Iraq War at a time in which the entire Democratic establishment is rallying, and he talks about it as what's less noticed.
Spencer, can I ask you to Spencer, just back up for 1 second. We lost you there for about 30 seconds, or maybe 10 seconds is more accurate. I don't know if the Wi-Fi is a little shaky, but just go back to, you were talking about the speech. Just start back at that point.
Oh, sorry. So real quick, Barack Obama gives a famous speech in 2002 at a time in which the Democratic political elites are, rallying around Bush for the Iraq War and embracing the Iraq War. Obama is doing the opposite and calling it a dumb war and signaling his opposition. What's less often noticed about that same speech, which is to an anti-war rally, is he's describing it not as a disaster on its own, but a disaster for the war on terror. That Obama's critique of the Iraq War is that it is a distraction from the war on terror, a detriment to the war.
Right, we took our eye off.
Not that the war on terror is itself a dumb war, and that, in a lot of ways, foreshadows the way in which Obama would govern as president, in which he takes an abolitionist perspective about only the Iraq occupation and CIA torture. Everything else, he's flexible about.
Just to continue with that, first of all, it's an interesting tangency that both Trump and Obama characterize Iraq as, I think Trump called it a stupid war. You just quoted, I think, Obama calling it a dumb war. They basically had the same reaction. Which I think many of us do now, though you're absolutely right. At the time, it was widely supported within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. What's the international dimension of all of this? I want to, again, come back to Obama a little bit, but when we look around the world now, we certainly see authoritarian tendencies and authoritarian practices in many democracies. Many countries are wrestling with similar issues, France, other parts of Europe, certainly Eastern Europe, et cetera. Do you see a kind of larger phenomenon? And could you imagine, your book and your reporting is obviously focused on the United States and what happens here, but do you see a deeper kind of trend or set of trends that link together all of these disparate political histories?
Well, certainly the war on terror, it drove mass refugee flows from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe, which prompted this wave of reaction. That reaction was already underway to a lesser extent particularly after 9/11, as right-wingers on the continent used it as an opportunity to talk about Muslim immigration or simply Muslim minority statuses in their own countries as basically a prologue to what we understand now here in the United States as replacement theory, that these populations were not there to be part of a broader culture, but to undermine that broader culture from within. That's normalized now in the United States as well as on the European continent. Beyond that, there were documents from the Chinese Communist Party that were leaked to the New York Times in 2019 about establishing and justifying the apparatus of Uyghur cultural genocide in Xinjiang. And among the very striking aspects of those internal documents was how they referenced how they could use the American reaction to 9/11 as a template. Which is to say that America at the time of 9/11 is the unchallenged global hegemon. Now we are a challenged global hegemon, but nevertheless, that is the case. And what the United States decides to do is exempt itself from what it calls the rules-based international order, or to put it differently, an order that it establishes after World War II, through which to channel its hegemony and through which to work for its hegemony. But now after 9/11, it's unsatisfied even with those meager restrictions. Other countries, when they reach moments of similar opportunity for their own either outwardly aggressive or internally repressive opportunities, are as well, we see this manifesting, take that opportunity shown by the American example and say, if it's good enough for them, why not for us? Vladimir Putin does this when he both threatens Georgia in 2008 and then when he invades Ukraine in 2014, and is very quick to read the United States, its back to it, its recent history of unprovoked aggression. And if it's good enough for the United States, why isn't it good enough for Russia? The United States doesn't have a good answer for this because there isn't a good answer for this.
Do you see well, let me back up. You talk about Obama and Biden as well, a little bit at the end. And in both cases, one of the things that you show is that this phenomenon of the war on terror shaping the politics and really, as you put it, destabilizing the politics of the United States is a bipartisan enterprise. Though again, there are obvious differences, but it's fundamentally a bipartisan enterprise. And you don't really see an enormous difference between Democratic or Republican presidents in this regard. And I think on certain things, that's absolutely right. On other things, less so, but that's a smaller kind of debate. The book doesn't have a lot of, I guess, either prescription in terms of what can we do now, or maybe kind of deeper historical perspective. You kind of start at 9/11 and you tell the story forward. So I'm just curious if you want to respond to either of those time periods. So one sort of answer that touches on both, or one tangent we could take would be to say, really the problem stems from the American obsession with the Middle East. And that if the United States had not been so deeply embroiled in the Middle East for decades, we wouldn't have seen 9/11, all the different ways that it arose through connections to Saudi and elsewhere coming from the Gulf War even earlier. And likewise, if we were to disentangle ourselves today from the Middle East, which perhaps we're doing, that's certainly rhetorically often said inside the Beltway, we're starting to do that, we will be better off. So you can run with either of those perspectives or connect them as you wish, but how do you see that playing out?
Well, I guess what I would say is that, American involvement in the Middle East is an example of the broader phenomenon, which is that America decided after the fall of the Cold War that it was a global policeman. It was the case that as it acted like a global policeman in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in North Africa, it generated massive amounts. Well, massive is probably, it generated very intense resistance from a very small group of people, and probably passive acceptance of that from a broader cohort, which is to say that America responded to the critique of how it treated Muslim life exceptionally cheaply in the Middle East with treating it exceptionally cheaply on a much grander scale. And that is ultimately the predicament that America finds itself in after having done all that and telling itself it's its own justification for why it can't end these enterprises because it would ultimately mean too great a danger. It is generating that very danger by fact of its enterprises, by the way in which the war on terror continues. As a historical matter, when you look at the operations of the war on terror, particularly around torture, around surveillance, around detention, around child separation, the historical view shouldn't start with 9/11. It shouldn't start with 1991. It shouldn't start with the post-World War II international order either. It should start with 1619. When the pirate ship, the White Lion, arrives in Jamestown in August of 1619, bearing the first kidnapped African people to be brought into enslavement in the United States, they are being held in what, as a post-9/11 observer, would recognize in stress positions, right? John Yoo, when he is writing a memo about the treatment of detainees in military custody for a very interested Pentagon, he references an 1873 memoranda by the contemporary Attorney General, who was justifying the imprisonment and massacre of the Modoc people after they decided they were going to leave the US reservation for them in Oregon and return to their land in what the United States now calls Northern California. Similarly, something like 26 out of 30 of the generals who command the counterinsurgency in the Philippines after 1898, which is the first place that American troops start waterboarding people. They are veterans of the Indian Wars. You see all of these continuities very deep throughout American history. The 9/11 era is an inflection point, but it's nothing new. I describe it, I try and describe it as a doorway to all of this exceptionally ugly American history, given this atmosphere of patriotic emergency. All of this stuff is very deeply embedded within America, and redressing it will require asking ourselves some very hard questions about precisely how deeply we have to examine all of these continuities and what we end up building instead of them. You asked that I don't have a lot of prescriptions for how we get out of this era. I kind of just have one big one, which is that the only way you end the war on terror is to organize. Elite politics, Democratic and Republican, have proven over 20 years they will not end the war on terror. They will only reproduce it in different ways, some more obvious than others. It has to be movement politics in America. You had mentioned the continuities about some of Trump's coalition's antipathy to the war on terror, as well as Obama's. I think that demonstrates that the war on terror has never been substantively politically popular. There have been enough elite lies to drive up enthusiasm for enterprises like the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. Ultimately, when we look at it over a 20-year period, those periods of enthusiasm are brief and they lead to a broader antipathy. If the war on terror is going to end, it will not be because presidents end it. It will be because presidents are compelled to end it by the American people.
I mean, I have to say, I'm not sure I agree with that last part, that you're right to say, if you ask people, is the war on terror popular? I think it's probably correct that it's not. But if you look at, just take one example that you spent a lot of time on, which is Guantanamo, which is a very interesting and important one, there's no appetite in Congress or in the White House for ending that, despite really compelling reasons to do it. And so I think you're right, but I think the American, if we're relying on the American people to end it, I don't think it's ever going to end, because people really are fearful of terrorist attacks. And
I think, can I interrupt?
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're confusing the American people with the American Congress.
I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll find out, but we haven't seen.
You're certainly right that there is enough elite antipathy to closing Guantanamo Bay. It is also quite structural. Similarly, very important military antipathy to closing the Guantanamo Bay.
Right, not an easy problem to solve.
It's certainly not, and it's a very easily demagogued one. But that is not the same thing as public enthusiasm for Guantanamo Bay. It is a reiteration of what incarceration always demonstrates, which is that you lock people up long enough, the broader public will forget about them.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I guess it's more the fear of some kind of attack. The thing that motivated so many people in the years after 9/11, as you know, was the fear that there was going to be another attack. And you and I are both on the left side of the spectrum. We're generally going to agree. I agree with your book and your arguments overall, even if I might, as in this conversation, take issue with certain things or press you on certain things. I'm on the same basic side. But obviously, if we had Dick Cheney on this discussion, he would say, look at all the things that didn't happen. Look at how safe we've been, which is a sort of double-edged sword. You use that in the book to say, well, maybe a lot of this wasn't really necessary, or you imply that at certain points. Maybe this wasn't necessary. It's continuing well past its expiration date for various reasons. And you're not the first person to say that, but that sort of counterfactual is very difficult to make. We don't really know. We don't know what was, if you ask a John Brennan, as I know you've spoken to John Brennan, I've spoken to John Brennan, many people have, and people like that will tell you, oh yes, there's so many things you don't know that we stopped. Now, again, we can never prove that or disprove it. So there's sort of this fundamental uncertainty, and I think political life or politicians are driven by a fear of the uncertainty. And the notion that if we let people out of Guantanamo and they did something bad, you say the same about prisons, that's going to be on my watch and I'm going to suffer for that. It's very motivating to them. So that's why I'm not that optimistic. I'm not saying you are optimistic or should be optimistic, but I don't find this an easy exit at all, even after 20 years.
No, I don't mean to say that it is an easy exit at all. I take your point about the ways in which this is so easily demagogued. I mean, I think that's kind of a central point of the book. I think you've got to ask in that circumstance. 939,000 people, at a minimum, are dead because of the war on terror. 9/11 is always going to be an exceptional event in the history of terrorism. To judge the war on terror as well, as long as there's no second 9/11, then it's a success, is a way to transform 939,000 people into 939,000 corpses. And simultaneously, every time as a reporter, when I've gotten into the internal documentation, as I have, of the NSA and the CIA about their counterterrorism operations, and the same thing with the military, a really consistent thread emerges. And it's not just me, it's also all of the disclosures that we've seen from inside, of course, of the last 20 years, which is, to be really blunt about it, that they were lying, that everything they said about the necessity of these operations or the efficacy of these operations in preventing terrorism is very often either a lie or a self-delusion. And Dick Cheney will, and John Brennan for that matter, will say as much as they want to ensure that their political and bureaucratic prerogatives are preserved when it comes to the war on terror. But that's not the same thing as the truth.
Let me make sure we get some time for questions, and there's quite a few audience questions, so I'm going to turn to that. So the first question, really the first one out of the gate, which is an interesting one, is what do you say is the most important lesson you've learned from your research for this book? And then the part two is, how do you think we can avoid electing another Trump? But that's not necessarily connected to the first part. So answer either or both.
Sure. So I think the most important thing that I learned in writing this book was the ways in which American history has these currents run through it so often. In reaching back to the White Lion, when you start looking at when you start looking at the operational practices of national security, one of the things that you kind of learn as a reporter really quick is that, so much of this relies on institutional muscle memory. So then it's incumbent upon you as a reporter to go back and well, where have those muscles been flexed before? And you can see throughout, a lot of CIA torture, as you can read in Greg Grandin's book, Empire's Workshop, comes right from the CIA's dirty wars in Latin America. A whole lot of the war on terror's political life is something that owes a tremendous amount to Cold War anti-communism, certainly in its elite formulations. So looking back on American history from the perspective of 9/11, you really learn a lot of continuities if you are willing to trace them. How to not elect another Trump? Well, first of all, I will, of course, argue that whether you elect another Trump or not, it's really important to strengthen the institutional safeguards of democracy, because there's always going to be another figure like Trump. It's how vulnerable you are as a country to the damage that structurally a president like that can inflict. I would certainly argue that a really good idea in the advent of another Trump or similar presidency is that there not be a forever prison open, like at Guantanamo Bay, because pretty soon someone's going to fill that prison. They will fill it not necessarily with just the people that were considered America's enemies on 9/11, but through a redefinition of what terrorism is understood to mean, which is going to be, broader and broader cohorts of Americans who aren't, with a MAGA agenda. So I would say, in terms of not electing another Trump, that's going to be a question for the political reporters, of which I am not one.
Let me just ask you on your answer to the first question about the lessons that you learned. Several times in the conversation, you've, I think, rightly pointed to continuity going back, as you said, even to 1619, certainly through the Cold War and Indian Wars of the 19th century and so forth. So you also talked about China and Russia and other countries. So I'm just curious, do you think there's something inherent in a great power, being a great power, that entails this kind of behavior? So in other words, China is doing many of the same things, in fact, on steroids compared to what we're doing. What's happening to the Uyghurs is enormous and on a scale and scope that makes Guantanamo seem like nothing. So I'm not trying to defend what we're doing. I'm just pointing out that it is a huge problem that transcends the US. Do you think there's something simply about, are there great powers who don't engage in this? Is there something simply, is it inevitable in a certain sense? Could we have even it?
I mean, empire is really bad, right? This is why empire is really bad, because all of the people whose lives and dignity is trampled on the road to constructing those empires. I certainly think that's true. I think the particulars matter because they show where those avenues of conflicts are and where those kind of tendencies within the particular empire to act in those specific ways are. So, most definitely.
Yeah, I mean, of course, our values are very different, and so I think.
Are they though?
I do. I certainly think I'm not going to defend China's actions in any way. But, the values that are espoused by the Chinese Communist Party are pretty different. And I think in some ways that makes our actions more worthy of censure, though I think both are worthy of censure.
I would disagree with that. I don't think our actions are what we say. I think our actions are reflected in what we do.
Of course. I just mean there's more of a disconnect between our espoused values.
We tell ourselves that we have these values. We like to portray ourselves on the international stage as having these values, and we like to portray ourselves to one another as having these values. And I would argue that the United States does not have those values. The United States has the values of Guantanamo Bay, the CIA black sites, and on down the line. That America so consistently acts in these ways that it reflects what its values and its interests truly are. And I don't put a lot of stock in a lot of the, I think, exceptionalist discourse that comes with pretending that the Constitution is America's values, because the Constitution is not what America follows.
I want to get back to the questions, but I'll just say I think the rest of the world does see it differently. And in fact, the question I'm about to read reflects that. Maybe the best example is the blowback for China from its, you talked about abuse of Muslims in the past, or Muslim life being treated as cheap by the United States was one of the reasons that gave rise to 9/11. But what's interesting is how little blowback China has had for its much more egregious acts. And I think one way to explain that, no one really has a great answer to that, but one answer is that the world does see us as different. And so when we do those things, even at a smaller scale, they're viewed as much worse than when China does. And that's one reason China has seen virtually no cost for its actions. But I don't want to get off on a tangent. Let me go to the next question, which is sort of related. So this question reads the following. Despite these abuses by the, quote, police state that Mr. Ackerman has described, the US continues to be highly sought after as a migration destination. Why the disconnect?
Because the United States is rich. Like, people aren't coming to the United States just because, like, they like the rhetoric of American political freedom. They're coming to the United States because they're, in economic need, as well as in many cases political need of coming to the United States. And when they're in political need of coming to the United States, right now, as well as, in many, many periods of American history, starting in, especially in 1920, they are denied access to the United States for those political reasons, very often as they come from places that the United States has politically and economically destabilized. I live and I'm born and raised in New York City. It's an immigrant city, and you really just can't escape this, that people come to the United States because wealth is increasingly being hoarded around the world in places like the super rich of the United States. That is what primarily drives migration. I take the questioner's point, which is that the United States, and yours as well, that the United States definitely espouses these values, and they're attractive values, but they're not really what the United States does.
Next question. What needs to change in mainstream politics to end this, meaning the war on terror, presumably, and all of the kind of ills that you described? And what's the most important thing we can do as citizens?
I think organize. I think this is, not just a solution to the war on terror, but a necessary activity of citizenship, particularly as our democracy comes under increasing threat. Go to more meetings, organize your neighbors, get more active with one another, because the concerted acts of Americans for justice is the not only most powerful thing in American political life, it is the only thing in American political life that has ever changed America for the better. It also shows how, despite all of these continuities that I've talked about with American history, that there's another side to American history as well, which is working with one another to overcome these sorts of atrocities, to redress them materially, to stop them from happening in the future. I think no matter what, the United States, even if it were to end the war on terror tomorrow, would be obligated to pay reparations to those people who lost their lives and were immiserated by the war on terror. We can, leave that aside. There are obviously different understandings of what justice requires. But I would just say this is not a hopeless story. This is not a picture whereby we are fated to live in this destabilizing world of forever wars. But it is very important that if we don't want to live in those worlds, in a world in which a rapacious capitalist super elite destroys the planet and increasingly relies on state functions that are primarily repressive more than in any way benefiting the peoples of the world, that it's necessary to organize against that and take the power back for ourselves.
How important in that organizing is electoral politics? So in other words, we have a midterm coming up, we've got a presidential campaign not that far away. Is it important that people who read your book and agree with you support the Democratic candidate? Is that sort of electoral politics a little bit beside the point because it really doesn't matter? What's your take on that?
I don't think it doesn't matter. I think supporting a Democratic candidate doesn't get you the work you're looking for. What does is forcing those candidates, particularly Democratic candidates that seem like they might possibly be more open to this, but this is also the case for Republican candidates as well, forcing them into a binary choice between retaining political power and retaining the war on terror. That's being a little bit 30,000 foot about it. I don't want to say that electoral politics is unimportant. It's the way politics is conducted in the United States in terms of determining who serves in government and how power is meted out, as well as who has to suffer that and who gets to enjoy the benefits from it. Just that American electoral politics is not particularly democratic. I think a lot of people are seeing that now, perhaps more than in recent years. And in order to make them democratic is not a process that happens one day in November every other year, or depending on what state you're in. It is a process of organizing to strengthen democracy from the grassroots up. But that's just one reporter's opinion.
Great. Next question. Could he say more about the connection between European Islamophobia and US replacement theory, e.g. the ties of the far right? So kind of transnational far right rhetoric and politics.
Yeah, basically, it's a great question. The continuity there basically with Europe being something of a leading indicator of where the American right would go. Very quickly in Europe after 9/11, this kind of latent hostility toward Muslim immigration ramps up with this opportunity that the 9/11 era poses, which is to say that it considers open societies to be simultaneously what we need to most defend and also internal threats to themselves on the other hand. You see this in figures. I'm terrible with pronunciations of this, so I apologize for this, but like Dutch figures like Geert Wilders, I believe I'm saying his name correctly, he speaks at the so-called Ground Zero Mosque disaster in 2010, encouraging the United States, encouraging Americans on the right not to replace New York with New Mecca. The Europeans are very accustomed to this over time, particularly as they have dealt with the wages of decolonization, which is this horror internally understood amongst white Europeans that the peoples that they formerly dominated are now coming back to the metropole and demanding rights and opportunities that they never intended to extend to them in what had always been a fundamentally extractive relationship. The American right at first is somewhat tempered by this because of the kind of unique positioning that, as you mentioned earlier on in our discussion, the United States likes to employ in order to portray itself positively on the world stage and positioning itself as benefiting not only the elites of allied countries, but the peoples of them as well. The longer that the war on terror persisted in a circumstance of producing neither peace nor victory against a non-white enemy that it never precisely names, the greater the opportunity for the frustrations of that to be visited on ever more civilizationally understood enemies. And so the American right over time becomes more and more reflective of what the European right had been starting from the very beginning of 9/11.
This is probably our last question, but it relates directly to the issues of the right that you were just discussing. So the question is, intelligence agencies have identified right-wing extremism as the greatest national security threat. Not 100% sure that's true, but let's assume it is. Do you think a greater focus on right-wing extremism could divert attention away from the war on terror, or do you worry it could reproduce on a smaller scale the war on terror?
I'm very worried about it reproducing that. I think it is very alarming that in the response to January 6th, we basically have no real political response at all. We have a securitized response aimed not at the people who prompted, who sounded the call to insurrection, but by the people, but targeted the people who answered that call. Which is to say that, of course, anyone who committed a crime on January 6th ought to pay a price for that crime, but that we've learned from the war on terror that security solutions to political problems are doomed to failure. They're doomed to making those political problems worse. Right now, what you hear from the American right is a language of pretext that will justify ever more repressive measures when the right returns to power. You hear this so often throughout the war on terror, but now especially, this is the meaning of Stop the Steal, right? This is the meaning of saying the election has already been stolen from us, so a coup is justified in order to get the quote unquote real Americans, people like us, wearing that MAGA hat, back in power. This is an incredibly dangerous phenomenon. It is also a dialectical phenomenon that the war on terror can feed, but it can never, in fact, extinguish.
Great. Well, Spencer, thank you so much for coming on. All of you paying attention still, there is a link, I should have mentioned this earlier on, in the chat for the book. Spencer's book is available in, I think, every bookstore around. And we really appreciate having you on, Spencer, and I hope you come back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.